Today we're talking about this, Sony's new 16mm f1.8 G lens. It is a very small lens, but also quite capable. We'll go over some basic specs, and then I'll boot up Lightroom and show you some sample images. It reminds me a little bit of the 20mm 1.8, which I am a huge fan of, but it's even smaller than that. It's only 304 grams. I'll do some size comparisons and B-roll to the newer 16 to 25mm 2.8 and the 20mm 1.8, but this is the smallest of a lot of them, and it feels incredibly light. It has a 67mm front filter thread, an 11-bladed iris, and the minimum focus distance is 15 centimeters, which is about half a foot. The manual focus is linear and has a really nice response, and the lens itself is dust and moisture resistant. For autofocus, it has Sony's newest XD linear motors, which are rated for up to 120 frames per second burst if you want to use it on something like the Alpha 9 Mark III. Price-wise, I'm told it's going to be between $800 and $1,000 US. I don't have final price yet. If I get it while editing this video, I'll put it up on the screen now. Otherwise, check the link in the description. Despite its small size, they've still managed to cram all of the common G Master lens features onto this little lens here, including an iris ring, which you can de-click, as well as an iris lock, so you can keep it fixed to the A position if you just like to adjust your aperture with your camera. It's got an AF/MF switch, a function button, and of course that manual focus ring, which, like I said, is completely linear when manual focusing, and the focus throw is pretty decent. I got it around maybe 130, 140 degrees, so not too bad. And when you are manual focusing, the focus breathing on this lens is really good. There is a little bit, it's not perfectly corrected, but it's very, very small amount, and you only see it when you rack from absolute minimum focus to infinity. And when you turn on focus breathing compensation, it only corrects the frame a very small amount, which lets you know that there's not much focus breathing to correct in the first place. So even without focus breathing compensation, this lens is a pretty good performer. So feature and function wise, it has everything you want in a lens, and it does all those things really well from just sort of a raw hardware perspective. But let's boot up Lightroom and take a closer look at some of the sample images. Okay, let's continue with the minimum focus distance discussion, and you should be aware that all of the test images were shot with the Alpha 1 Mark II, wide open at f1.8 unless otherwise specified. So like I said, the close focusing reproduction is actually pretty impressive for a 16mm lens. Here's a Rubik's Cube. You can see it almost fills the entire frame. And when we punch right into the center there, it's also very sharp. Here we're looking at longitudinal chromatic aberration, Bokeh, which is when fringing is added to out of focus areas to the foreground and background, usually of opposite colors. And, we can see that there's a little bit here. We're getting a little bit of a teal in this direction and a little bit of a reddish kind of color in this direction. But we're magnified quite a bit. If we look at it even at a reasonable distance, I would say Bokeh is controlled quite well on this lens, especially considering this was wide open. A little bit more of an extreme version of that. If we zoom right in, we can see, it's really, really well controlled Bokeh on this lens. Here's another example to take a look at Bokeh, but also lateral fringing against the sky. And as you can see, there isn't really either. So that's excellent, really sharp. And yeah, no issues there at all. One more example here of a little tree branch against the sky. And we can follow along and we can see again a little bit of that red maybe right there, but very minimal, really good control of chromatic aberration. So that's great. Let's move on to Bokeh, punching in here in the center wide open. And yeah, there's some onion ringing going on. It's not the cleanest Bokeh balls in the world, but what are you gonna do? It's a 16mm lens. What I am noticing though, is you can see there's some odd shapes off to the side here. So if we take a look at this image, which puts them up in the corner at 1.8, there's a combination of a distortion problem that this lens has in general, mixed with some cat's eye, creating these sort of interesting looking shapes over here. If we stop down to 2.2, you can see that they start to round out pretty nicely, but they're still, elongated. And then at 2.5, and then at 2.8. You're never going to get them perfect when shooting all the way to the corners with 16mm, but after 2.8, it's kind of diminishing returns. Really, 2.2 does a pretty good job of rounding them out on its own. And then we have one here at 5.6, just to show you that you can see the 11-bladed iris, and also what they look like if you're stopped down a little bit. Nothing tremendous on the Bokeh side, but it's okay. And then I wanted to show you some focus transitions, some extreme ones. This is pretty much minimum focus, and then the background is very far away, so you can see what an extreme focus transition looks like. And then here's another one to show you a little bit of how it maintains its sharpness when focused at minimum focus, but then also how those focus transitions occur. I realize that a lot of people are probably using this more for like architectural reasons or vlogging, and not so much the close photography, but those won't have any issues to worry about because you're shooting buildings from far away. So in case you do want to use it like this, I wanted to show you what the really severe focus transitions look like. And it's not too bad. The only close focusing sort of anomalies I'm seeing is just like a little bit of that sort of glistening aberration that happens around here. But overall, for a 16mm lens focused at 15 centimeters away, this is a pretty good result. And the detail and richness of the colors are quite good, so no complaints there. Now, these next few images were me trying to get you somewhat useful sample images to show detail and stuff in the frozen Arctic tundra that has been Canada here in February. Probably like the coldest, snowiest, iciest winter I've had in a really long time. I was only going out for a few minutes at a go. My battery life was dying quickly. I was dying quickly out there. So please excuse the following depressing sample images here. But look, sharp icicles. So yeah, if you need to photograph those in February in Canada, we got you covered. This one I call, do I have to shovel any more snow or am I done now? And look at those, look at the snow detail, just incredible. This one I call, why did I walk so far away in this weather? And why does my nose have icicles in it? Oh God, is that gonna cause a problem to my eaves troughs when the downspout is frozen solid all the way up? And this one I call photographer who has had enough doing sample images of stupid things for lens reviews in minus 10,000 degrees centigrade. But as you can see, not much chromatic aberration at all. But luckily, when the weather near me is too frigid and unforgiving for me to muster up the will to take pictures outside, I can always download soothing vistas of warmer locales from Storyblocks, the sponsor of today's video, a stock media platform that offers unlimited downloads of diverse and high-quality content for one predictable subscription cost. And Storyblocks offers a whole lot more than just clips of people frolicking in the sand. In fact, their library houses over 1 million HD and 4K video files, images, and motion graphics templates. And jokes aside, those motion graphics have actually saved me time on previous projects, especially now that they added DaVinci Resolve templates, much better than my previous and tedious method of making those graphics in Photoshop and then animating them in the Edit tab using keyframes. Plus, anything you download from Storyblocks is 100% royalty-free with clear-cut licensing, so you can focus on creating, not worrying about usage rates. The platform is incredibly easy to use, and the library is frequently restocked with commissioned content based on customer demand to ensure you'll have access to files that are not only high quality, but fresh and diverse. So to get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/undone or click the link in the description. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about distortion. This lens has a lot of it. Now, obviously, you can enable profiles, which will do that to your image and make it straight and look great. But if you don't have profiles enabled, or you're shooting raw, or you're doing it on a different camera or something like that, the distortion is significant, as you can tell. Interestingly, I compared it to the 16-25, and at 16mm, it performs quite similarly to that one. So the profiles for the 16-25 also work reasonably well on this lens. I suppose it's one of the consequences of making smaller and smaller lenses that are wider and wider and faster. Eventually, something's got to give. And in this case, and in the case of the 16-25 2.8, it's the distortion on the wide end. Again, though, profile's corrected well. And you can see that as far as vignetting goes, there's not really much there because the corrections didn't really do much to affect that. So vignetting's good, distortion quite strong. And I have a shot of my studio here to give you a bit more of like a real estate, residential kind of vibe to show how that distortion would affect an actual sort of wide angle shot of a room. And, on first glance, it actually looks pretty good. I also shot this at 2.8, so you could see a little bit of what a focus transition would look like in a more practical scenario. So this is in focus here, and you can see how it kind of fades across and what a 2.8 background would look like. Obviously, you could stop down to 5.6 and this wouldn't be a thing, but if you want to know kind of how the out of focus areas look at 2.8, they look like this. But more importantly, if we go down to this corner here, you see this kind of shape, and the way that the floor kind of looks like it's fallen off to the side. That's what your distortion would look like more practically when you're not, shooting a fence. You can also see the effects of it here when we do our sharpness test. So at 1.8 in the center, let's zoom right in here. You can see that detail-wise and sharpness is really, really good for a 16mm shot this far away at 1.8. I think this is quite good. But if we go up into the corner here, we're definitely losing some, and you can see the distortion, how it affects the card a little bit. Now, if instead we focus up in that corner, then obviously the sharpness comes back and it looks pretty good. But now our center on the right one, the one that we focus in the corner, we lose a little bit there. So something to consider, obviously. I imagine that the way that people are going to be using this lens for the most part will be more like the example on the left. And in that case, I think that this is still acceptable for the extreme corner. And based on the MTF charts that I saw for this lens in my briefing, I think you're actually going to be good probably all the way out to about here, and it's only up in this extreme corner that it softens up. But lastly, let's talk a little bit about flare and Sunstars. The minimum aperture on this lens is f/22, which is what we're shooting at here. And although the bokeh isn't great, you can see that Sunstars are. You get really nice, defined spokes that come out of the sun, and it looks great. Flare is pretty well controlled, and there's situations where you can make it happen under the extreme, but it's not too bad. So here's no flare, and here's if you really let the flare come into the lens. This is worst case scenario, but if you even just pivot a little bit, it goes away. And this flare isn't too bad at all. You can see that we didn't really lose much in the way of contrast. A better example of that would be here. You can see how, dark and rich it is here. And with no flare and with flare, first of all, the flare that's coming in is very minimal, but you can see that it's not really affecting the blacks that much at all. Pretty much every aspect of this lens gets top marks. Bokeh just is what it is for a 16mm. Distortion is really the only thing that should be of concern, but profiles correct it quite well. Okay, so I thought it might be fun to show you what the 16mm lens looks like on a full frame camera, because it's so much lighter and it seems like it lends itself to this kind of vlogging style because you don't have to zoom a 16-35 or whatever would have existed before. This will let you also see sort of how far away I'm holding it. This is full reach with active stabilization on, so there's a little bit more of a crop in and it looks like this. But honestly, you could also be super stable and just hold it this close. And now the way that my arm's bent is this is comfortable. It's not that heavy. It's super comfortable to do this. You could probably even just, honestly, just hold the camera like this even. And you still get this, look at this frame. I also want to do it at 1.8 so you could see, even with the 16mm lens, you still get pretty decent background separation here. But more importantly, something I think would be cool is that this lens would also lend itself well to an APS-C camera, because then you would have like a 24mm field of view equivalent, which is often what a lot of content creators like to do. So let me set this one to APS-C crop and we'll check it out. Okay, now here it is at full stretch with it set to APS-C crops. This is more of like a 24mm equivalent. And you can still get, I don't know, something like this. Again, I have active stabilization on. If I turn off active stabilization, get a little bit wider of a frame, maybe hold it in tight, that's what 16mm set up as a 24mm equivalent APS-C mode looks like. Again, still pretty good separation and still pretty good frame considering how I'm holding it. And obviously back here is okay. But if you were to put this on a tripod, say like this, and make this your talking head on, like an FX30 or something like that, you could have a really close sort of intimate shot, but still get a decent looking frame here. I think this is really versatile for that kind of thing because this is light. This feels really good. It's sort of like a vlogging setup. Overall, I'm a big fan of this lens for this type of purpose, the dual purpose between APS-C and full frame. I'm also just a big fan of its functions and features and how it's built and focusing and everything else with it. I really only have one complaint, which is the distortion. The chromatic aberration is great. The focus breathing is great. Bokeh is fine for 16mm. Sunstars are great. Flare is great. It's a great lens. It's a great lens overall. And, for the price, it's reasonable based on the price of the 16-25 and the 20mm f1.8G. These types of lenses, these 1.8G lenses that Sony make, I think they're the sweet spot for the value in Sony's range. I wish that they would actually make them sort of all the way up to focal length instead of just the G Masters. Now there's one more lens that Sony's releasing today. You might be able to see it over my shoulder here in this camera that I also want to test in a similar situation. I'm not really going to cover it, but it is there, 400 to 800. So why don't we go ahead and throw this on the same setup here and see how it works for vlogging as well. There we go. Now that's vlogging. Gorgeous. Yes. Is this good content?